In May 1945, a victory by the Allies over Nazi Germany in the Second World War was a cause of wild celebration across the rest of Europe. The liberation of France from German occupation tasted especially sweet for the French, who shared it across their vast empire. But it also left a bitter taste in countries expecting the dawn of a new era of independence. Men from the colonies had fought hard for de Gaulle's free French on the promise of a better future. But West Africans had been gunned down by French machine gun fire in Senegal. Nationalist unrest in Algeria had been brutally put down in a new reign of terror. And Syria and Lebanon had been set ablaze. De Gaulle's promise of independence to them had only been half kept. Even though France recognized their sovereignty, it still hoped to maintain control there. The French Air Force's answer to revolt was to bomb Damascus, and the airstrikes were devastating. Thousands were killed and many more wounded in attacks that were especially pointless. France was about to withdraw completely from the Middle East under pressure from the British, who aimed to dominate the region. By 1946, Lebanon and Syria had both gained full independence. The foundation stones of the empire were beginning to crumble. But France had no choice, because 10,000 kilometers away, another front was opening up in Indochina. After World War II, the nationalist movement re-emerged in what was considered the jewel of the empire, Vietnam, led by the 55-year-old Ho Chi Minh. The communist leader proclaimed his country's independence on the 2nd of September 1945.
Nước Việt Nam có quyền hưởng tự do và độc lập, và sự thật đã thành một nước tự do độc lập.
His declaration revived people's hopes.
Vous savez, ces temps-là, j'avais 16 ans, jeune. Quand je regardais Ho Chi Minh qui dit que maintenant il faut libérer le pays, il faut chasser l'esclavage, tout ça, on dirait un baume qui vient au cœur.
Cambodia and Laos immediately joined the power struggle with the French. In response, the government dispatched the experienced General Leclerc to the region, along with 35,000 men, to deal with the nationalists from the north of Vietnam, known as Viet Minh.
Malgré les difficultés qu'oppose la végétation, malgré les retards engendrés par les destructions du Viet Minh, la zone de paix s'étend avec l'avance de nos troupes. Les éléments déchaînés ou les ruses des fanatiques n'ont pas de prise sur des hommes qui se sont battus sur 3 continents. Hier, le méchoui arabe, aujourd'hui, le cochon anamite.
Under military pressure, Ho Chi Minh agreed to negotiate. De Gaulle had left power a few months before, so new Prime Minister Georges Bidault welcomed the Vietnamese leader to Paris. But during Ho Chi Minh's stay in Indochina, the French Governor-General proclaimed South Vietnam an independent state affiliated to France. Ho Chi Minh signed a Franco-Vietnamese agreement, but considered he'd been betrayed. Ho returned to Vietnam, but the official South Vietnam ceremonies could not disguise the double dealing by the French. Beneath his smiling demeanor, he knew that war was inevitable. On the 23rd of November 1946, the French Navy shelled the northeastern Vietnamese port of Haiphong, causing several thousand casualties. For survivors, the memory is still vivid.
Nhà tôi ở Hải Phòng ấy, thì tôi đi theo gia đình trong lúc bây giờ là khoảng độ 14 tuổi, tôi đi ra khỏi thành phố, trong khi thành phố là đang cháy, thành phố Hải Phòng. Đấy. Người ta gọi là tháng 5 rợp trời hoa phượng đỏ là thành phố Hải Phòng đấy. Thì lúc bây giờ là tháng 11 là chưa có hoa phượng vĩ, nhưng mà thay thế vào hoa phượng vĩ là lúc là lửa cháy tất cả các dãy phố ở các hàng hoa phượng vĩ chưa có hoa.
A few weeks later, the North Vietnamese Nationalist Army retaliated. The First Indochina War had begun. It would last 7.5 long years. France's political class stubbornly refused to recognize the spread of mass liberation movements. This willful blindness continued another 20 years. Back home, people had other things on their mind than Indochina. In 1946, France still bore the wounds of the Second World War. Cities remained badly scarred, and there was still rationing. The French were much more preoccupied with supplies and reconstruction than the future of the colonies. But there would be a price to be paid for preserving the empire in the shape of reform and bloodshed. The government of the Fourth Republic had already started to change. Even by 1946, there were already around 30 members of parliament representing the colonies on the benches of the Palais Bourbon. There had never been so many. In March 1946, Aimé Césaire, MP for Martinique, initiated a change to French law to make Guadeloupe, Martinique, Guyana, and Reunion Island French overseas départements, meaning areas of government. In sub-Saharan Africa, several MPs also pushed for reforms. The Ivory Coast MP Félix Houphouët-Boigny voted to abolish forced labor, while thanks to the Senegalese MP Lamine Gueye, the status of citizen was granted to everyone in the colonized territories. A new era was dawning. The Fourth Republic finally promised equality for all its subjects, for many not before time. In October 1946, the term empire was replaced by l'Union Française. The idea was that there would no longer be French colonies, but that France, the overseas départements and territories, would combine to create one France, regardless of race or religion, officially at least.
Côte à côte sur les bancs des collèges, Européens et Africains concourent au même diplôme, seront appelés aux mêmes responsabilités, car les distinctions de race et de couleur ont été supprimées. Ensemble, le noir et le blanc vont construire un pays où il fera meilleur vivre, où la nature hostile sera maîtrisée.
It was a nice image, but beneath the surface, the same inequalities remained, and France and the colonial authorities still called all the shots.
Cette Union française nous laisse toujours un arrière-goût amer. C'est toujours des formes améliorées de garder la même mise sur ces pays africains au sein d'une union. Parce qu'une union où il y a un qui est sur un fauteuil aussi haut que la tour Eiffel et l'autre est sur un tabouret aussi bas que le parquet. Dans cette union, il n'y a pas d'égalité, on n'a pas le même pouvoir de décision. Et donc cette union, voilà pourquoi pour nous, franchement, c'était de la poudre aux yeux de mon point de vue.
France had not abandoned its imperial strategy, quite the opposite. To appease the people and win over hearts and minds, it invested in large infrastructure projects.
Avec les deux barrages de l'Oued Meleg et de Ben Metir, une nouvelle fortune est donnée à la Tunisie. Cette fortune qui se traduit en énergie et qui se chiffre en kilowatts.
This construction was not altruism, but self-interest. The investment was mainly in infrastructure that enabled raw materials to be transported to mainland France. Colonial wealth was pouring back into France. In return, new schools were opening, but only around 8% of the children in the colonies attended them, and the curriculum was not tailored to their needs.
Moi, je vais à l'école primaire puis au lycée, je n'apprendrai jamais rien sur mon pays, mais rien.
On nous apprenait à connaître tous les grands fleuves de la France, leur débit, leur longueur, leur navigabilité. On allait même jusqu'à apprendre quel est le poids de pain mangé par un Français à l'année.
Je raconte souvent que quand on a le cours sur les volcans, on apprend tout sur les volcans d'Auvergne qui sont morts depuis je ne sais plus combien de temps. Alors, à l'île de Réunion, nous avons un volcan qui, très gentiment, entre en éruption plusieurs fois par an, et on aurait pu avoir une leçon de choses en direct, d'aller voir ce que c'est qu'un volcan. Eh bien non. Non, on apprenait les volcans d'Auvergne. Je veux dire, c'était grotesque. Mais ça n'a pas beaucoup changé aujourd'hui.
And while the school children of the empire were learning about volcanoes in the Auvergne, one of the worst instances of colonial repression of the post-war era was taking place off the east coast of Africa. One that didn't appear in the history books for decades. Madagascar had been colonized by the French half a century before, but by 1947, people had had enough of the colonial regime. The democratic movement for Malagasy rejuvenation was founded by two MPs, Joseph Raseta on the left and Joseph Ravohanj, and it now demanded more freedom, but without success.
Miasa telopolo tsy mahazo karama. Ny vary nalaina tao réquisition amidy amin'ny vazaha colon. Nefa ny hoaninay tsy misy. Ka ngamba mazava zany a.
Zay koa ny tsy dia hoe tsy ho tifo ratsy. Efa tsy zakatsika tsony ny ataony fa alao takina ny tanindrazantsika. Zay no nahatonga ny ady.
On the 29th into the 30th of March 1947, nationalist unrest broke out. Armed with spears, knives, and axes, the insurgents attacked the houses of French settlers and colonial officials. The number of attacks increased. In the town of Muramanga, the rebels attacked the French army camp. They murdered more than 1,000 settlers and local Malagasy accused of collaborating with the French. Moroccan and Comoran reservists and Senegalese riflemen were shipped in with a mission to impose peace at all costs. A clear signal must be sent out, as in Sétif, terror must reign. What started as a local rebellion turned into a full-scale war. Soldiers appeared in Muramanga and set it on fire. Dozens of prisoners were dragged into the forest and shot. Fearing for their lives, local people left their homes and hid.
Mafy be mahitsy na ny sakafo ary indrindray tsy mahita anona hoanina fa tena mampatahotra. 3 semaines zay ny tany naty ala.
Hanina voankazo mata no hanina tany dia voalavo mba ny androngo na ny hoditra iza tsy ohatr' izao fa hafa mihitsy. Marokonrokona mihitsy la ny moka any anaty ala.
Military aggression turned into judicial repression. 3 Madagascar members of parliament were arrested and were denied the immunity of elected representatives. They were sentenced either to death or life imprisonment with hard labor, although their sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment. After months of violence, cameras were allowed into the villages. The message was clear: don't mess with the French.
Olona firy reto no aresy azy indray dia natsanganay le saina fotsy dia nilamina ny resaka teo.
Derniers échos des troubles graves qui ont désolé et ensanglanté Madagascar. En présence de la population du village, attentive et silencieuse, la soumission est acceptée. Un buffle est sacrifié selon les rites immuables de la tradition madécasse. Cérémonie naïve, mais chargée de sens dans un pays primitif où la loi ancestrale a conservé une valeur et une force exceptionnelles. Marqués au fond du sang expiatoire, ces égarés d'hier reprendront place dans cette communauté de l'Union française qui ne peut vivre et prospérer que dans le calme et la paix.
It was a victory for strength and terror. The uprising was responsible for the loss of around 40,000 local lives. The massacre is inscribed in the collective Malagasy memory. The 29th of March is an annual public commemoration day in Madagascar, but not in France. Three weeks later, France welcomed the whole world to Paris for a session of the United Nations. Ironically, at the Palais de Chaillot, the 58 UN member states voted to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Permettez aux représentants de la France de dire sa fierté d'avoir vu adopter à Paris la Déclaration des droits de l'homme. Nous considérons, nous Français, qu'il y a là une espèce d'hommage rendu aux efforts séculaires de l'esprit français dans la recherche d'une paix universelle.
In the 5 years since the Second World War, by 1950, France had succeeded in keeping a tight grip over its empire. North Africa and Madagascar had fallen into line. They'd kept the lid on the Caribbean. Only Indochina had caught fire, so the French still thought they had everything under control. But the tide of global history had turned. In the Cold War, Washington and Moscow now wanted independence for countries of the old empires to weaken them and build their own power. It was already happening as the British gave up India, Ceylon, and Burma, and the Dutch withdrew from Indonesia. But while other empires were collapsing, France went against the grain and would not let go. Meanwhile, in sub-Saharan Africa, several political parties in different countries combined in the early 1950s to form the RDA, a Pan-African movement with communist affiliations in France. One of its leaders was the Ivory Coast MP Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who openly wanted to end the colonial period. France could not possibly accept this, particularly at this time of the Cold War. Paris decided to try and break these rebels, who were a little too close to Moscow for its liking. In Ivory Coast, the French army action was brutal. On the 27th of January 1950, Félix Houphouët-Boigny narrowly escaped imprisonment. The next day, Senator Victor Biaka-Boda was found decapitated in the woods. Thousands of their supporters were arrested and hundreds of villages destroyed. A cloak of secrecy was spread over this abuse, silence on the side of the executioners and among the victims.
Il y a un vrai tabou en fait sur ces questions-là. On m'a rien raconté dans ma famille sur l'histoire des velléités d'indépendance de la Côte d'Ivoire. C'est des souvenirs, je pense, traumatisants. C'est comme des blessures et les gens n'ont pas envie de rouvrir ces blessures-là. Là, je pense notamment à la génération de nos grands-parents ou de nos oncles qui ont aujourd'hui 60, 70 ans. Ils n'ont pas nécessairement envie de reparler de ces choses-là parce que c'est des souffrances.
The only record of these events is the film Afrique 50, Africa 50, shot secretly by a young 21-year-old filmmaker and Communist Party member, René Vauthier.
Ici, le chef de village Sikali Ouattara a été enfumé et abattu d'une balle dans la nuque, d'une balle française. Ici, une enfant de 7 mois a été tuée, une balle française lui a fait sauter le crâne. Ici, du sang sur le mur, une femme enceinte est venue mourir, 2 balles françaises dans le ventre. Sous cette terre d'Afrique, 4 cadavres, 3 hommes, une femme, assassinés en notre nom à nous, gens de France.
Afrique 50 was the first French anti-colonial film. It was banned for nearly 40 years. Vautier was arrested and jailed, but he managed to distribute a version of the film secretly, which shocked left-wing activists. In Paris, the Communist Party demanded the release of the Ivory Coast prisoners. To avoid a new front opening up in Africa, the French government shifted its strategy and offered Houphouët-Boigny a deal. The charges against him and his party would be dropped if he cut his links with the French Communist Party. If not, the Ivory Coast would go the same way as Madagascar. Houphouët-Boigny accepted and fell into line. He even became a government minister, and Ivory Coast enjoyed a privileged relationship with the motherland. France had achieved its short-term goals in Africa, but after Madagascar and Ivory Coast, the Caribbean felt the most tension. The 3 years since becoming French département had seen very little change. The large families descended from the first European settlers, the Békés, remained firmly in charge. The black population was underpaid and was kept on the edge of society in extreme poverty.
On vit mieux parce qu'avant cette loi sur la départementalisation, c'était lamentable et pire. Mais on n'a toujours pas la capacité de se faire un destin. Ça veut dire que on n'est toujours pas capable d'avoir un avenir même sur son sol. Et j'imagine simplement l'horreur dans l'esprit des parents qui voient leurs enfants ne pas pouvoir monter plus haut qu'eux et devoir les rejoindre dans les champs de canne.
Social conflict was deepening. People were beginning to realize that being a département of one France was only a smokescreen to keep their islands within the Republic. In 1950, the MP for Martinique, Aimé Césaire, wrote a long essay called Discourse on Colonialism. The colonialists may kill in Indochina, he wrote, torture in Madagascar, imprison in Black Africa, and crack down in the West Indies. But the colonized now know that they have an advantage over the colonizers. They know that their temporary masters are lying, therefore, that their masters are weak. In the next episode, France's grip on its empire weakens much, much more in Algeria, but first in Asia. Its hold on Indochina was on the brink.
After World War II, France's great empire began to unravel. In Vietnam,
everybody was throwing themselves into the streets, bursting with joy, kissing each other.
And Algeria.
If the Indo-Chinese managed to beat the French army, why not us?
The decline continues in episode 2 of Blood and Tears, French Decolonization, on Al Jazeera.